Um, Hello, everybody. Welcome to the Waterfront Museum. My name's David Sharps, and I'm here with our board chair, Annik LaFarge. We have some exciting news to announce today, and very excited to share with you that we are now in partnership with StreamTime Live with a harbor cam. We'd like to give you some background information about the lighterage ship and also a glance at our story of how the Waterfront Museum came to be. Take it away, Annik.
Thank you, David. I'm now going to share my screen and launch our presentation. So I learned about the Waterfront Museum while I was doing research for my book about the High Line, which is known as the Park in the Sky, that was built on an abandoned railroad viaduct once owned and operated by the New York Central Railroad on the far west side of Manhattan. It opened in 1934, and the elevated portion ran from Spring Street to 34th Street, carrying fully loaded freight trains 30 feet above street level. The story of this elevated freight railroad is inextricably connected to the Hudson River, which, as you can see from this gorgeous photograph, is just a stone's throw to the west of the viaduct. Like the railroad, the Hudson too played a vital role in moving goods around our country in the 19th century. And if you're walking along the High Line, you can see this history for yourself in the architecture around it, including many former warehouses that line both sides of the park. And this is a period photo of one of several giant refrigerated warehouses along the High Line. It's at 16th Street, and notice how it has almost no windows because this building was used for cold storage. Today, it's the headquarters of the Drug Enforcement Administration. Now you see lots of windows for the DEA agents to gaze out of. And just below the warehouse, you can see pedestrians walking along the High Line Park, which opened to the public in 2009. This is a period photo of the R.C. Williams Company headquarters. They were a leading importer of goods from overseas, and they built this warehouse in anticipation of the High Line Railroad, which you can see at the left of the photo. This is a contemporary photo taken from the High Line Park. Today, this building is home to the Avenue School, and its classrooms actually overlook the park. Now, every major rail line had its own warehouse along the High Line. This is a period photo of the Baltimore and Ohio's warehouse and train yard on 24th Street between 11th and 12th Avenues. It was torn down many years ago and today is a vehicle maintenance facility for the United States Post Office. This is a historic photo of the Terminal and Central Stores warehouse on 11th Avenue and 27th Street. It was an enormous storage facility that served many different rail lines. And after the railroad closed, it became a famous nightclub called the Tunnel. And this is the building today. So these and many other warehouses that connected to the High Line were part of an intricate network that married the Hudson River with the nation's rail lines. And they were also part of what was called the lighterage era. And this fascinating transportation system is part of the story that our museum, the Waterfront Museum, brings to life. Now, it's helpful to begin the story by remembering that Manhattan is an island. Today, there are 2,000 bridges and tunnels in the greater New York area. But for the entire 19th century and into the second decade of the 20th, there was no way to transfer a fully loaded railroad boxcar across the Hudson River. And trains, of course, were the main engine of transportation in that era. In 1900, there were 185,000 miles of track in America, and that equaled those of all the rest of the world combined. This map shows the four great trunk lines as they existed in the early 1870s, the Baltimore and Ohio, the Pennsylvania, the Erie, and the New York Central. And I highlighted the Hudson River in blue on this map to illustrate the problem that the lighterage system solved. The Transcontinental Railroad was completed in 1869, and trains came from across the western part of the country, carrying all sorts of goods from produce from farms to items sold by the Sears Roebuck catalog. And every train that came east along the Transcontinental Railroad dead-ended at this blue wall of the Hudson River. So to get their stuff into Manhattan and the New England states to the east of New York, the trains had to travel 140 miles to the north to a huge rail yard in Selkirk, which is just north of Albany. And then they crossed a railroad bridge and they came down the other side, another 140 miles, both times hugging the shoreline of the Hudson River. And this was a total of 280 miles to transport goods across a river that's less than a mile wide. So the solution to what was called the Selkirk hurdle was the lighterage system. in which a vast network of flat barges or car floats, known as lighters, because they lightened the load of the railroad, were towed across the river by tugboats. And this became one of the most important transportation systems in New York City and in the country. In the 1930s, National Geographic reported that as many as 5,000 barges crossed the Hudson River each day. The writer Philip Lopate wrote that in their heyday, the barges were almost as synonymous with New York's iconography as its skyscrapers. And all the goods they carried were delivered into warehouses that were owned by the railroad companies, some of which you saw earlier. And here, everything was repacked or stored and eventually reshipped to its final destination by truck or on another train. Now, the photos I've shown so far are of actual train boxcars, and in some cases, a locomotive being transported across the river. But there was another style of car float as well, the covered barge. And this photo shows the New York Central's barge named Amboy, docked at one of the piers in Manhattan. This one shows another New York Central barge called Kruger's, a bit upriver on the Hudson. And both of these photos, by the way, were made available to us by Thomas Flagg, who is an eminent rail historian. And I want to mention that David and I are both very grateful to him for his generosity, as we are to all the photographers who allowed us to use their images today. So this is our barge, the Lehigh Valley No. 79, home to the Waterfront Museum, in a photo taken by David. This barge was owned and operated by the Lehigh Valley Railroad, and it carried all kinds of cargo, from coffee beans, dates, and nuts, to a variety of general merchandise. And this is a historic photo taken from a boat on the Hudson River of the Lehigh Valley Railroad's pier at West 26th Street. And just behind it, you can see the Starrett-Lehigh building, which was the Lehigh Valley Railroad's massive warehouse. It had 2.2 million square feet of warehouse space. And this is a shot taken from the pier looking across the bike line and West Side Highway into a huge opening in the corner of the building that a fully loaded boxcar could pass through. The Starrett-Lehigh building today is home to a variety of companies in the worlds of design, fashion, architecture, advertising, media, and publishing, and it can be seen and admired from many places along the High Line. This is a shot I took from the park, and you can see some of the 8 miles of windows that wrap around the entire Starrett-Lehigh building. This is another shot of the Lehigh Valley's former pier on 26th Street, which today is home to a restaurant and 2 other historic ships, the John J. Harvey Fireboat and the Frying Pan, both of which are also open to the public. And now I'm going to turn things over to David Sharps, our museum president, whom you met. He's going to tell you how he came to be the captain of this wonderful and unique vessel and museum. But first, we hope that you'll consider making a contribution to the museum by going to our website, waterfrontmuseum.org. We are thrilled to be open again and welcoming visitors, but like every other nonprofit in New York City, we've had a challenging couple of years because of the pandemic, and we're so grateful to you for your support. So thank you, and here's David.
Okay, thank you, Annik. I'd like to give you my story. It all began with me learning to juggle up in the mountains of in the Appalachian Mountains of Maryland. I got a job at the young age of 21 with Carnival Cruise Lines back when they had just one boat. I worked on stage with an act that was known as Serious Foolishness. From there, after working about 100 cruises, I moved to Paris, where I lived on a houseboat and went to a school called L'École Jacques Lecoq. After 2 years there, my partner Karen and I moved to New York City, where we started working the streets and film and TV and theater. It wasn't long before I found myself caretaker of another barge, that being the Gary barge, affectionately known as the Mud Puppy. The Gary barge was a great place to be, a wonderful home, but unfortunately, developers had other ideas. We wanted to be a part of progress and not just a consequence of progress. So, bound and determined, I floated up all the goods that I had, packed them up on rafts, and floated them with the help of a shad fisherman up the river to Edgewater, New Jersey, where there was none other than the mud flats. The mud flats of Edgewater was where a barge that I bought for $500 lay in the mud. This is what it looked like when I bought that barge in 1985. Surrounded were many other vessels, forgotten, obsolete. With containerization starting in 56, it took 30 years to make the barges obsolete, but they did indeed lose their purpose. They became a spot for a shad fisherman, a place for a marina, Boy Scouts, all different types of uses started using these old barges. I wanted to float mine. I put on some hip waders, got myself a gasoline pump, and with literally no experience, was able to go down into the hull. And after 2 years of pumping 300 tons of mud, little by little, day by day, the hull, full of mud, was finally evacuated. With all of that mud gone, I then began to turn my attention to the wood, the structure. Having had no carpentry experience, I started working with my buddy, Desmond Kovic. Jimmy, Desmond Kovic, and I worked on the barge and started with the doors and all the various floorboards, and anything that looked like it was rotten got torn out and started to be replaced. After about 2 years, we had the barge ship shape and afloat, and we were able to take it to our first port of call, that being Hoboken, New Jersey. Down by the Erie Lackawanna Plaza, we christened it under the administration of Patrick Pasculi and part of his waterfront access plan. Hoboken was ready to receive a wooden barge and a tugboat. We started some exhibitions showing us all the different purposes and causes and missions of the lighterage era. I found myself falling in love with the New York Harbor. You'll see some photos of some of those earlier exhibits. This photo shows the Lehigh Valley when it had its cabin up top. Indeed, there were families that worked on those barges and lived up top. Ours had its posts cut out so that they could move the goods around with hydraulics, and we no longer had the cabin up top. Some barges were insulated and carried things that were needed to be out of the weather, either frozen or heated. The barge returned to Liberty State Park, home of the Lehigh Valley years before, in the small basin of the Morris Canal. Here we opened our doors several days a week for the public in the very location that the barge had operated in years before. My background in the circus led us to begin to do a series of showboat performances. We towed the barge to Piermont, just like years before the Periwinkle did, as you see in this photo. Lo and behold, in the 20s and the 30s, there were barges just like mine working the New York Harbor as a showboat. Stage Magazine had a wonderful article on the various showboats that plied the New York Harbor. Through arts and culture, we were able to start bringing people back to those once forgotten waterfronts and start to bring people back to an area where they could enjoy the sights and sounds of the river that had been long forgotten. Down in the hall that where all that mud was, we placed a neon exhibit for a short time. We did some theater, including Alfred Hitchcock's play, Lifeboat. On board the barge, we had a wonderful machine that kids and families absolutely enjoyed and adored, by George Rhodes. Soon, we were looking for a home that would be permanent. Our answer came in meeting with Pete Seeger and a group from the Clearwater trying to find river lovers downstate. It led me to somebody who led me to somebody else, which led to Greg O'Connell in Brooklyn, New York, in Red Hook, an area where Greg had just begun a new development. Lo and behold, the very pier that we were on at the end of Conover Street, you can see at one time was a bathhouse. Bathhouse at the end of Conover Street. Now the Lehigh Valley was beginning our operations. My wife and 2 kids, we moved to Red Hook as our home. The kids went to school, my wife went to work, and I worked on the barge and welcomed folks as they came down to Red Hook. Red Hook began to develop. The Red Hook Stores building was converted into a Fairway supermarket. Con Edison helped us in bringing a subway or a shuttle bus down to our public programs. Arts and crafts programs started bringing in the local community where we did arts projects. It wasn't long before we were experiencing some problems that we had never had before. The shipworm. Shipworms were eating the piers and eating the barge, and we were experiencing leaks that we had never had before. Our solution was to find a dry dock upstate where we towed the barge past the Statue of Liberty, up the Hudson River, under the George Washington Bridge and all the other bridges heading up the Hudson and into the New York State water system, where behind lock number 3, we found ourselves, with thanks to the New York State Canal Corporation, able to dry dock the barge for the first time. Here's a drawing done by Mark Peckham. Another view of the same drawing shows our $35,000 worth of wood and a crew of 10 people who were from North Atlantic Shipbuilding and Repair. David Short, his mission to fix that barge. We took the entire bottom off the barge, put spiles in all the spike holes, took off planks that were on the side of the barge, those 5-inch planks that go along the side that were rotten. We ended up taking off the entire bow and the stern and sistering those beams. Then began the work of putting the boat back together. The bottom, long leaf yellow pine planks being rolled into place. The entire bottom was replanked, caulked, and fastened. Matt LaDuca pre-drilling so that we could get those spikes in without splitting the wood. A brand new bottom. And that last plank that we put in using a special Jenny clamp that allowed us to push the very last plank in. New wood all around on the barge. At that point, each seam needed to be caulked. Here you see a picture of Don Taub caulking. Of course, you have to work also on the planks that you're sitting on. The next photo shows that we're actually sitting on a plank that needs to be repaired. So we actually had to float the boat at this point and move it a few feet and set it down again. Before we moved it, we put on the kydex and the tar that now cover the barge. The tar protects the wood and would smother any shipworms that might get past the sheathing, and the kydex sheathing gives us a thermal plastic barrier so that the shipworms can no longer get to the wood. After 100 days, the barge was ready to be put back into the water. One agreement that we had was we could use that dry dock up in Waterford on several conditions. And one of those conditions was that we appear on the waterfront for the tugboat roundup. Days after we finished this huge 100-day project, we had thousands of people coming aboard to enjoy the barge that had just been refit. Just a few days later, we were coming back to Red Hook. But when we came back to Red Hook, we had to go to a new port of call. Our port of call on Greg O'Connell's property at the end of Conover Street had also been eaten by shipworms and had collapsed. John Quadrosi Jr. over in the Gowanus Canal allowed us to stay on his property until we could finish the completion of a new dock back on Greg's property. We worked with a lot of welders and Rycon construction and built ourselves a new port back in the old spot where we were in the cove at the end of Conover Street. Building out of steel would mean that the shipworms wouldn't affect that port that we were building. Gangways with aluminum again meant that we wouldn't have to deal with the destructive effect of the shipworms. A new home port. Here was our final home port with the big T showing where the gangway would go. Gangways were brought in from the street and hung with a large crane, giving access to the barge from the shore 40 feet away. Like they always say, if you build it, they will come. We took the barge all the way up onto a showboat visit up to Kingston, and they did come. We were having a wonderful rebirth as a new floating theater and classroom. But not only did the public come, also we had one day the US Coast Guard. The US Coast Guard showed up and we had to go through a long process of including a fire alarm system and all these safety conditions. And after another long 6 months of work, we were able to open up at this time as a Coast Guard certified attraction vessel. Here you see the interior of the barge. Work dockside did continue with us doing certain bits of maintenance. Sometimes it was the planking on the outside of the boat that needed to be replaced. Prime with paint from Benjamin Moore. Tar donated by Palmer Asphalt. Hull planks above the water being replaced. Deck beams, deck planking replaced. Covered over with a good waterproof system, the Durex mat system. The barge was starting and beginning to look new again. But the rot just seemed to be endless. No fear, tear out that rot. Get back to the good wood. Use those products that were donated and all that knowledge that we had learned. A new stern, a new bow, all done from the water. And finally, 20 years after I took those first iron corners off, they were back on again. The barge was starting to look ready to go on the way. This was right about the time of the Hudson Centennial, the Hudson-Fulton Centennial. Working with Captain Pam and the tugboat Pegasus, the tug came and got the barge, and we started visiting other communities. We went back to Hoboken. Back to the Erie-Lackawanna Plaza. We went to Hudson River Park, both at Pier 84 and Pier 25 in Chelsea. Up by where the Intrepid is docked here on Pier 84. We went further upriver to Poughkeepsie. We visited Hudson. We visited Kingston. Here, the Clearwater came alongside. And the little Main Fay took us up from Waterford into the little lock back where we could from Troy to the tugboat roundup once again. Here, of course, what we really knew was how to entertain the public. Here you see my daughters in their flying mermaidens. Every showboat's kids should be able to have a trapeze act to entertain the public. The flying mermaidens. Puppet shows. Circuses. Exhibitions, and a show about Amelia Earhart. Pirate shows. Circus. Music series in Red Hook went from about 1994 up through about 1998. Thanks to George Tocci and Allison Tocci. Theater. Shows of Moby Dick and On the Waterfront and Anna Christie. Arthur Miller's A View from the Bridge by Brave New World Theater. And of course, our school groups. Many school groups would come to visit. The space changes every week, several times in many different fashions, sometimes completely empty. It looks vast. Exhibitions sometimes feature the barge and vessels of its own. Our research has led us to a book where here there were three ladies, sold to the ladies, about three women who bought a barge for $500 in the Gowanus Canal in the 40s and took it out to Long Island, where they had a good time as a houseboat with visitors from other boats that would come and visit. We also met someone who grew up on the top of the barge, Alice Scanlon. The next photos will show us Alice and her parents sitting there on the top of the barge. In Jersey City, we find out there was a gentleman who even built a rigging up on the top of his barge. He had worked the tall ships a sail, and as a retired captain, rigged his barge with a full rig up on top. Research found in the 1930s census, many, many different families that lived on the barge. This barge, the 79, had William and Christine Baird. We had found the captain and his wife who lived on this very barge, 79. It's always been my goal to get the barge back into its original condition, ready for the public, ready to present works of culture and the arts, historic preservation, divining a place for community and culture. I'd like to thank you for letting me toot my own horn. And want now to just remind you, please do go to our website, where that's where you can always support us and hear about all the different programs that we do at www.waterfrontmuseum. We have a lot of sponsors and a lot of people to thank. Our board of directors, the O'Connell Organization, the O'Connell Family Foundation, the New York City Councilman Carlos Menchaca, the New York City Department of Cultural Affairs, Humanities, Barbara Cooper and the Gallery Group, our board of directors, and all of our many funders. And with all of this, it gives me great pleasure and great pride to give you a website where you can go now and see our harbor cam and see a view from the barge, a view of the New York Harbor. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, everybody. And whoops. And that's it. Thank you very much. I'm now going to figure out how to end our meeting. Thank you so much, everyone. Bye, David.
Bye-bye.